Hello. Thank you. I would like to start with thanking the organizers from the NTU Management Review and Asia Pacific Management Review for giving me this honor to be making a presentation at the 23rd Asia Pacific Management Conference in Taiwan. I'm AllaudeenHameed from National University of Singapore, and I'm going to talk about the journey of publishing in top finance journals. So the journey consists of a few steps, and I'm going to kind of go over the steps that I think makes the basic ingredients to a good publication. So to start off with, I'll talk about generating research ideas, and then how, assuming that you have stumbled on some interesting ideas, then how do you implement them? The next step is writing up the research results. Then go on to the feedback process, which is an important thing in social sciences, iterations at journals, and then finally the publication. So how do you start with generating ideas? Well, you want to start with working on topics that are interesting to you, right? So you are the one who's going to be working on it for a while to come. So it has to be of interest to you. What interests you is something that you have to figure out along the way. Okay, so one of the things that you worry about is this topic or research question of interest to a broader audience, right? So then it goes on to the question of why do we care? Okay, so we could care for many reasons. One, maybe the research has academic interest. Maybe it helps to address an important issue in financial economics, an unresolved issue in finance that this research will help to shed some light. It could be related to what we teach in finance, right? So either in our graduate class or undergraduate class, some basic concepts sometimes, leads you to think about, is this a reasonable assumption that we make when we teach the students? It could also be a topic that could be of interest to financial practitioners and market participants in general, either investors or broker dealers or analysts and so on. It also could be a topic that is of concern for policymakers. So it doesn't really matter who, maybe it's a combination of these interested potential interests, right? So as long as we know there's a broader interest, then this could be that would make a good research topic. So where do we get ideas from? There are plenty of papers in finance, and it's growing exponentially over the years. And there are many puzzles that are still unanswered, right? So unanswered questions in finance would be a source of research ideas. And where do you get these puzzles from? Besides the literature, you can also see it from attending conferences and seminars. So conferences and seminars also reflect the current trend of research, right? It could be on climate finance, it could be on fintech, it could be on big data, it could be on COVID-related topic. So there are many trends in research and in finance research. So you have to decide which of these trends are of interest and is exciting to you. So it has to come from your personal interests, right? In addition to what the trend is. And sometimes, reading news, Wall Street journals, or listening to policy debates can also generate potential ideas. So the question is, it's not like there's one source of research ideas, but it could be coming from a combination of these things. And the more you think about it, the more likely you're going to come up with, ideas, and you can sharpen this along the way. So there are many ways to generate ideas. And what is a big idea, right? So typically, the big idea is one that contributes a lot to our understanding of the topic. How can it contribute? It can change conventional thinking, right? It could be, you could be dealing with a setting that may help to resolve a debate. And the setting can come from new data, novel data, because your data has got superior quality, it's got more details that previously people were not able to employ. Or maybe you have a data that involves some exogenous shocks that gives you better identification, right? These are important contributions that help us sharpen our knowledge of finance. And the big ideas are also those that appeal to a broader audience, has got bigger applications, right? So then that would be a big idea compared to one that only appeals to a smaller subgroup. Okay, so how do I know that this is a big idea? Well, that assumes that you understand the literature. So this is important because we don't start on papers from vacuum. So we are always adding to an existing knowledge base. So what does this understanding literature imply? So it just, first of all, obviously you have to read the papers and in the topic and understand what has already been documented. But you also have to be actively thinking about what you read, not passively just reading the papers. Okay, so you think about what's the main idea in the paper. You want to ask yourself, if I were to do the paper, would I do it? Is there a better way to do this? That could be a contribution, that might help to shed light or maybe even reverse the current results. And you want to see how these papers, the literature, relate to what you are thinking as your research idea. This could involve, to help to relate your idea to the literature. Maybe you want to write down the model and then, test the idea with some data. Again, you need to have something that brings a new thing to the understanding of the literature. So how do you, when you test with the data, you need to be open-minded. I mean, that's the way I think about it. It's not like you have a fixed results in mind and looking for the data to torture the data until it speaks what you want. But I'm prefer to just let the data tell you what is going on. Have an open mind. Okay, so you need to know when to hold it, right? That means you need to know if the data does not fit the theory, does not fit the intuition. Does that mean that that's the end of the research, or maybe that leads to some, turning around of what you already know as the conventional wisdom, right? So when your results do not fit what you had expected, that could be interesting too. And of course, you also need to know when to walk away. Termination is an option. That means terminating the project is an option if you think that the idea was good at the beginning, but it's not how the world works. Okay, and you want to also be worried about sunk costs. No point putting in more and more time on research that you think is not getting anywhere, right? So you don't want to. The idea of sunk costs is you're putting in more and more time. It's just going to have a bad paper, but it's going to be costly in terms of your time and energy. That's why it sometimes helps to work with others. So co-authors bring different perspective, different criticism to the idea. And as you discuss the idea, if you cannot convince your co-authors or potential co-authors of the idea, maybe that's not a good idea, right? And bringing in people with different perspectives is also useful, so that, right now with the flattening of the world, international collaborations are getting more and more common. So you may want to collaborate with people outside of your own school as well. So here I'm going to illustrate my experience on writing papers, and I'm going to talk about one paper or one topic. And this is a topic that everybody is familiar with. It's on momentum in stock prices, Jagadish and Titman, 93. The basic idea is stocks that have performed well in the past 3 to 12 months, continue to perform well in the next 1 month or 1 to 12 months. And similarly, stocks that has underperformed continue to underperform in the future. So this long short strategy generates significant alphas. And that's the Jagadish and Titman, which has got about almost 15,000 citations. So this is a well-researched topic. the momentum payoff does not seem to be explained by standard reasons like risk. Adjusting for risk actually makes the momentum even bigger. The momentum profits are large and persistent, and it exists across different asset classes. Then the question that we were thinking about, this was again, 10, 15 years ago, research paper that I did with my co-authors, we kind of looked at the literature, right? So the literature says there are potentially two sources of explanation. One is rational, could be risk-based, and the other one is behavioral, right? And there were several models that were being generated that tried to explain momentum, right? In these theoretical models, let me just talk about the first one, which is overconfidence and self-attribution bias. So, and there were two other, prominent models. So how do we test this model? So the way we think about testing models is to keep the implementation as simple as possible. Simpler ideas and simpler implementation is usually more appealing. That's my view anyway. So we focus on one idea. So we just focus on this idea of overconfidence, right? So you don't want to complicate one paper with many different ideas, and then, the main implications gets drawn down, right? So and then the key is to focus on one idea, but to do it extremely well, right? To identify all possible implications, test, and then make sure that the results are robust and strong, and rule out alternative explanations. So what was the test that we came up with? It was very simple, right? So the behavioral models predict that momentum profits ought to be higher when behavioral bias is higher. When markets are doing well, that's when we expect overconfidence, aggregate overconfidence to be large. And this is the implication of the Daniel Hirschleifer-Subramanian paper. Then we thought about what would be a simple proxy for overconfidence. And Gavreas and Odin paper suggested that it's again a theoretical model that suggests aggregate valuations when they are high, investors learn to be overconfident. So that's exactly what we did. We said, is momentum profits higher when the market is more overconfident, which is when aggregate valuations are high. And that's what we found in the paper. So that helps to distinguish the different sources of why there's momentum profit. And it shows that, there's a significant role for behavioral models to explain why we see momentum. So another way to think about ideas is not to stop at one paper. Think about, is there additional ways that you can test the same notion that momentum is driven by overconfidence, right? So what we did was, me and my co-authors in a second follow-up project, we looked at whether, we can relate momentum to liquidity. So the idea here is that liquidity and overconfidence are positively related. So we can so that implies that that could be one source of why we see momentum, right? On the other hand, liquidity would be an explanation for why we should not see momentum, right? When the liquidity is high, momentum is low. In other words, momentum ought to be concentrated in periods of low liquidity. And that's what we test in the second hypothesis, in the second model paper. We see if in periods of high overconfidence, okay, which is the bias is higher. And when the bias is higher, investors trade more, which generates higher liquidity. And this in turn generates momentum, right? So we find evidence consistent with our earlier work and supportive of the behavioral model that overconfidence generates momentum. And this is related to both the aggregate market valuation as well as the state of market liquidity. And we use more recent data, since there was like 10 years, 15 years gap between the two papers, and to affirm the finding. And we also use international data to show that the results are more universal. So this is, kind of filling the gaps in the literature by looking at different ways of testing the academic or the financial theory that has been proposed. So having generated ideas, the next step is to implement the research. This requires that, again, important to understand the literature, which means understanding the theory and setting up the basic empirical predictions. A lot of these are iterative process. It's not just that you get the idea, you test, and then based on the results, you might revise your idea again. So there's a iterative process. It's not a one-directional step, one step two kind of a process. It's important also to talk to people, talk to your colleagues, do brown bags. Brown bags are good as deadline to, to come up with the basic results and presentations. And a lot of times you find that seminars and conferences are an important source of this feedback process. Okay, so there's been some work on this topic of whether having more conferences is good or bad. There's a recent paper by SM and Bulkaran that looks at the mean number of conferences or papers published in various journals over time. And what you will find is that there are JFR, maybe RFS. So these are the journals that seem to have high number of conference presentations, right? Compared to, say, the big journals, they are still high, but they're still there, but it's not higher than the top journals. So if you want to go for top journals, getting signals from conferences and getting feedback from conferences is an important way of polishing the paper and the idea. Similarly, for seminars, you find that top journals like JFE, and RFS, they tend to, and JFQA to some extent, they tend to have high number of seminar presentations as well. And that's how these papers get polished and before they see final publication. Okay, so in terms of implementing research, it's good to work with co-authors. There are positives of working with co-authors. It's good because it helps to thresh out the idea better. It leads to faster execution, as you can specialize in different parts of the project, and can be fun if you have good co-authors. And there's some empirical evidence that suggests that co-authored papers tend to be having more citation. Of course, having more people on the project can lead to coordination problems, and can even lead to conflicts at times and the usual free rider problems, right? So when choosing your co-authors, you may want to think about a co-authorship that might last for multiple projects, right? So it's not just randomly picking a co-author, but co-author who complements your skill set, and somebody that you can have fun working together. Next is the writing phase of the project. So be clear in the writing, got to be clear about why is this paper useful, and how does it influence our thinking on the subject, and also why is it a big deal, right? So these are things that has to be very clearly illustrated in the introduction especially, okay? And you may want to illustrate your results with simple examples that will catch the attention, right, of the reader. So clarity is the most important, simple language, simple illustrations, highlighting the main findings in the paper, either in terms of quantity or magnitude of the effect. Stay away from languages which are difficult to understand, don't try to be too technical. That usually doesn't help with influencing others' thinking. So the writing part, title is the first thing that you think of, when you're writing the paper. It's got to be an informative title. The title basically has to reflect what the paper is about. What's the basic question that's being addressed in the paper? The abstract is a lot of people just spend time just reading the abstract and then they reach a conclusion about the paper. So the abstract is the one thing that you got to spend a lot of time in making sure that the key message is clear, right? And the abstract must give the reader the impression that this is an interesting paper and lead one to go on to read the paper. The next of all the sections in the paper, people spend most time thinking of reading the introduction, because introduction places the paper in the literature and talks about what's the contribution of the paper and what's the big deal about the paper, right? So that's why you need people all, typically spend a lot of time on writing and rewriting the introduction. The rest of the paper is just about being rigorous and being careful about the execution, right? So tables, the standard view is tables should be self-contained. Figures should be should paint the main results and help to convey the central idea in the paper, right? So especially the figures, if you can have the figure even in introduction, and if that helps to convey the main idea, that's great. Usually when I start a project with, especially with my students, I usually say, let's start with writing a proposal, a one-page proposal. Why is this project interesting? What do we expect to achieve out of this project? And again, this is just a proposal stage. So, you need to be convinced that it's something worth working on. And also it helps to putting it down in paper, helps to clarify the idea and helps to think about how to be positioning position of the paper. Of course, a lot of times is spent on writing and rewriting the papers before you think about submitting to the journal. And a lot of times, this is an iterative process of thinking about the idea, getting results, going back to rethink the idea, writing down the paper, and presenting it, right? As I said, there are a lot of top journals. Papers are usually presented multiple times in many conferences and seminars. So the feedback process is important because it helps to not just feedback the idea, but also the positioning, the execution, and helps to nail down some nuances that's not fully addressed in the paper, so it sharpens the paper, right? And also seminars and all those and conferences help to market the paper as well. And sometimes, going through the seminars and conferences gives you thoughts for the next paper. It'll help you to meet people like the potential referees and maybe even editors who could be in the audience. And sometimes talking to the audience after the presentation could be a source of future co-authors as well. And it helps, and doing a good job in all these presentations, helps to establish reputation and visibility as a researcher. An important thing is to make sure that whatever feedback you have, think about it seriously. And if it is not clear in the paper, then it could be that you need to rewrite to make sure that people don't have the confusion. So incorporate all the comments you receive as you revise the paper. What to present? So the most important thing in any presentation, especially like a brown bag, is to present the research question and why should we care about the paper, right? And emphasize the findings, the contributions. Graphical presentations are great. Provide the intuition and relevance of the paper. So if you can present the basic idea in a simple, intuitive way, that'll be the ideal, right? A lot of times, I think I've seen people spend a lot of time on literature reviews, especially in a 20 minutes conference presentations. That I think is probably not really important, right? Literature review, people who don't already know are not going to fully understand within a 2-3 minutes of presentation anyway. So don't spend too much time on lit review in this presentation and feedback process. Of course, your work should be more important than the literature. Here, I've spent some time in the last decade as editor of and an associate editor of several journals, which I've listed here. So what do I look for when I'm reviewing a paper, right? The key is what's new in the paper, right? I think I always go for the idea. Sometimes the contribution can be in terms of methodology. Maybe it's new data, provides a new angle to the topic, and maybe new results, right? So whatever it is, again, it's got to be succinct in the introduction, in the abstract, before I send it out to referees. So there are clear red flags, right? If the paper is not even properly formatted, there's too many typographical areas, these are red flags, and that, even if it makes it to the refereeing stage, it will be a, reason to be more skeptical about the overall results in the paper. So why are papers typically rejected? Because the most common reason is the contribution is small, right? So if you think that the referee is not correct about reaching that conclusion, then you have to make sure that you communicating the contribution clearly, right? If there is a communication problem between the authors and the referee, then the problem usually with the encoder, the authors themselves. I know rejections are upsetting even for the most prolific researchers, but you have to move on, right? Just get upset, take a break, but then go back to think about the referee reports more carefully. If there's a flaw, fix it. If there's a fundamental flaw that cannot be fixed, think about sunk cost, right? And to see whether maybe you had misjudged the contribution of the paper. Rewrite, refocus, restart, whatever works, for getting the paper to the next level. Appealing, which normally is not recommended, unless you think that the referee had made a gross error. In general, if you get a reject, you just take a break and, before you make any appeal decisions. Revise and resubmit is the best case scenario. So when you get a revise and resubmit, you do everything that the referee and the editor ask, and sometimes you might have to do more. There could be issues that arise as you respond to the referee comments, so you address all the issues. And in your referee letter to the referee, say exactly, usually I would just repeat the comments from the referee and then add my response to those comments, right? And then tell exactly where in the paper you address that in the paper, address those comments. Some responses may be in the referee letter, need not be in the paper, and some might go to the appendix and not in the main paper itself. So finally, you get acceptance. So this is a gradual process, unlike a rejection, which is abrupt. If you get conditional acceptance, then fix every remaining item. Don't take it easy, right? So you just have to make sure that you address all the remaining issues. Is this the end of the process? Not really. One thing that that researchers care about is the citation. So here's a simple analysis of citation, which was done a few years ago, based on Scopus. So looking at the top 3 journal publications, JFE, and RFS, and the next 3 papers, JFQA, next 3 journals, JFQA, JFI, and Review of Finance. And these are publications done from 1990 to 2010. And we look at what happened to these citations and in December 2015. And the data is from Renee Adams, my colleague, who shared this data with me many years ago. So here's a simple distribution of citation. So if you look at the top 3 journals, if you look at the 25th percentile, it's on average as 28 citations. But if you look at the top 4 to 6 journals, the citation again in the 25th percentile is lower. But if you look at the 75th percentile, the number is actually higher than the 25th percentile for top 3. What I'm trying to make is just because you get to a lower journal based on ranking doesn't mean that it's the citation or impact need not be lower. You can also get high impact from, as long as you're doing a good job in writing the paper and in marketing the paper. So that leads to the next question of what do you do post-publication, right? How do you market the paper? Again, important to do high quality work. High quality work, no matter where it's published, eventually will get recognized and get cited, and it influences the field. And be a supporter of your own work, right? Be a believer in your own work. Present to wider audiences, write simplified practitioner pieces, follow-up projects that might help to re-emphasize what you have in the old project or published paper. Incorporate this into your teaching, especially if you're doing a PhD class. Make data code accessible, and sometimes you can put your research into practice. So at the end, you are looking for maximizing influence. I think I had reached the end of the presentation. Thank you very much, and I hope this was useful.